Hello, everyone. Once again, welcome to another episode of Second and Saints. I'm John Hendricks, fresh off a vacation. I feel energized, recharged, alongside Louisiana Sports Writer Association's #1 ranked podcast, Locked On Saints. Ross Jackson, how are you, sir? Congratulations again.
Thank you, man. Thank you, bro. That means a lot. I appreciate that. Wow, shout out right at the top of the show. I absolutely love it.
I mean,
no, man, it was, yeah, no, it's cool. It means a lot. Super excited to have the honor. I always say that like my show is a love letter to the city of New Orleans and Saints fans beyond. And so it meant a lot to receive that recognition from the Louisiana Sports Writers Association. So let's see if we can build on it here in 2024, man. Let's see if we can get Second and Saints up there too, right? See if we can get 1-2 next year.
Man, you never know, man. You just don't know. But man, appreciate you guys tuning in. We didn't go live today, and just because things are going to happen, and Ross is about to go on vacation. He's going to Europe, so hopefully he does come back because we kind of need him and such. But we're obviously here. We're going to talk about the Saints roster projections, a final 53-man roster, because you wrote one on Saints News Network. You put it up, and obviously this point of the year, you can get probably about 80% of the roster, maybe 85%. I think the bottom 10 to 15, there's some fluidity there for the roster projections. But I guess I feel like I like the projections, right? Whereas, I was anti mock draft until we get to a certain point. I like the roster projections, but why don't you just say how you kind of came up with the thought process? What was the thought process? And, we can take it in and dive into it.
Yeah, for sure. So this roster projection that I did, or to borrow from my good friend Jack Collada, my roster projection was less about trying to project correctly, like what this is going to look like after the final roster cut down after the final preseason game, and more about like what's the state of the roster right now, right? Like if we were to look at and take into consideration, John, everything that you and I have seen so far at OTAs, mini camps, all that. Literally who was starting during all those things, who was in the heavier portion of the rotation, who was with the second team versus who was with the third team versus who wasn't getting reps and all those things. And then to just package that neatly into something that says, here are the guys that probably right now make up the top 53 based upon the rotations that we saw during OTAs and minicamp. And then what that really does is that it sets up where the battles are going into training camp a month, a little less than a month from today. So that's really the kind of crux of what the intent was behind this early 53-man roster projection. Less about right or wrong, more about like, hey, here's what we're seeing so far.
Yeah, I agree, because I think people get too hyped up and like, but you left this guy off, you left that guy off, and it's like, slow your roll a little bit. This is, again, like you said, based off some of the information we know and some of the stuff that we see. And a lot of it has to do with, we're going to get into it, but this special teams kickoff role is going to change the landscape of the roster. We've talked about that. And so I think some things like that, and obviously, some of these guys have a good chance at the practice squad and some more than others. But let's dive in. We start with the offense, quarterbacks. No real surprises there, right? You had obviously Derek Carr, and then Jake Haener, and then Spencer Rattler. Now, obviously, we're not talking about depth charts or anything, but I guess my question, I agree with you, which would leave Nathan Peterman off the roster, which we've talked about that he could be on the practice squad. He's a veteran quarterback, but why stick with 3 quarterbacks is the question versus sticking with 2 quarterbacks. I think that's the question I'd have for you.
Yeah. And look, that question is one that we typically have to ask every year, because outside of New Orleans, a lot of teams only keep 2 quarterbacks on their roster. Now, it's a little bit different for New Orleans because you could technically have 2 position designated quarterbacks on your roster and still have a third option in Taysom Hill that you can rely on. I don't know what Taysom Hill's technical position designation is going to be this year. We'll find out. I think fantasy football players are hoping for tight end. We'll see where that goes. But I think that for me, the other reason why this question becomes even more important this year is because you only have to have 2 now in order to have the emergency third quarterback. You can actually pull that emergency third quarterback off of your practice squad now. So you can elevate that player as what would be your 49th active player on game day. So you would have your typical 46-man roster. You could have your 2 practice squad elevations, and then you could have the emergency third quarterback, which is kind of nice. And so I think, though, that for the Saints, I don't know that they want to risk Jake Haener or Spencer Rattler, for that matter, to waivers this offseason. Because remember, in order for you to get them to your practice squad, you got to release them. You got to waive them. Hope that they make it through waivers and then add them to your practice squad. Then you run the risk of them getting poached. You can't do protections until Tuesday. So there's always that Monday where somebody can get snagged off of your practice squad. No matter what you do, there's no way to stop that from happening. And so for me, I just think the Saints are pretty accustomed to keeping 3 quarterbacks plus Taysom Hill on the roster. No reason for them not to do it again here in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with any of the points. And that's the thing, is you can't cut a Jake Haener or Spencer Rattler. I just don't think, based off of what we've seen, because we've seen Rattler's progression, right? We've seen Jake Haener be extremely comfortable in this offense. And again, you're going to have to figure out who is going to be that backup quarterback. And the third quarterback is likely not going to see the field much of any. You know what I mean? I think if they're going to use that roster, game day roster spot for something else. And I think with the training camp, you mentioned battles. That's the big one, right? Is who's going to be quarterback 2. And I like where Rattler has progressed. I'm not going to be ready to throw Jake Haener out of the equation just yet, because I think Haener probably still has the leg up for sure. Not probably, he does, in my opinion. Sure. But training camp's going to matter, obviously, with that. And again, Peterman being on the practice squad, that's where we mentioned, like, when Kellen Mond was on the roster, is like, man, there's too many of them. But one of those guys is probably going to be the practice squad, be designated as that emergency quarterback. But really no surprises there, right? I would say, unless obviously an injury happens. But Taysom Hill is that a factor as well too.
Yep. I would imagine too, if I understand the rule correctly, the third emergency quarterback can come from your practice squad, but I assume it could also still be, as I read the rule, it could still be the third quarterback on your active roster that you mark as inactive for that game. And so, like, even then, whichever one of those 3 guys isn't on the roster, you could save the game day spot, have them inactive for that day, and then probably still designate them as your third quarterback. It doesn't seem that they've eliminated the idea that you can make that third active roster quarterback that you make inactive for game day. Doesn't seem to limit you being able to make that guy your third quarterback too. So it could still go that way as well. Plus the Taysom Hill of it all, to where maybe you don't even have to do that if you don't want to. And I think that that's really good too, because I always make the thing about, we do this every year. There's going to be some undrafted free agent player that stands out, and everybody goes, oh, well, you can't put them out to waivers. They're not going to make it. And then they always make it. Shaq Davis last year, Emmanuel Butler years ago, several other examples out there. I think, who was the running back?
Darius Victor.
Oh, Darius Victor was a big one. Yeah, for sure. And then Abram Smith, I think, was the other guy's name or something like that. That was like the former Baylor linebacker, like running back turned linebacker, turned back to running back that everybody loves. And so, and we saw them clear waivers every single time. But this one feels a little different because it's the quarterback position that we're talking about. And then the likelihood of somebody getting poached as a quarterback off your practice squad, which I think we saw years ago with Ian Book, we could end up seeing. Yeah, exactly. So like it's a perfect example of why like quarterback is specific. But those other ones, I'm not too worried. A lot of teams are more focused on the guys that they sent to waivers and getting them back more than they are worried about the other guys' teams.
For sure. I mean, I don't think there's anybody that could probably disagree with that. I just don't, unless somebody gets injured. I mean, it's just, it makes too much sense. So that's 3 spots gone. Now we move to the running back, or the backfield, if you will. And it's interestingly enough, because we've talked about this before, but obviously the 3 running backs that you have, Kamara, which that situation we've talked, go back to past episodes. Don't forget to like and subscribe, all that fun stuff. But obviously we talked about Kamara and the sweet spot for that situation. I don't think we're at the panic stage. And again, go back to our last episode. We talked plenty about Alvin Kamara, but he's there. Jamal Williams, Kendre Miller, and then you put Xander Horvath, the fullback, on there. I'm interested to hear why putting Horvath on there, because I could see that as a spot where no fullback makes the roster and they put him on the practice squad, elevate him, do all that stuff from a numbers perspective, just for transactional stuff too.
Yeah, totally a way that they could go. I think that the reason why I put Horvath on there is because of Dennis Allen's comments about wanting to make sure that they really utilize a fullback in their offense. And so I could see them maybe trying to save that roster spot and then elevate first until those elevations are gone, and then add that fullback to the roster. It makes a lot of sense. The other thing too is Taysom Hill, Dallin Holker, Foster Morrow, those guys, if on your roster, which, spoiler alert, all three of them I expect to be on the roster, those guys could all play out of the backfield as well. I think the one thing that gives me just a little bit of a kind of boost towards Xander Horvath is that he followed Derek Foster, New Orleans Saints' new running back coach, who was formerly of the Los Angeles Chargers. He followed Coach Foster here to New Orleans, which is one of those kind of under-discussed storylines amongst all of the like connective tissue when it comes to the players on this roster, coaches, their connections before they were here in New Orleans, coaches' connections to one another, yada, yada. And so I kept him on the roster, but I don't mind the way that you're thinking at all in terms of keep him off the active roster, have an extra roster spot that you could use for those special teams purposes, unless he's going to be one of the special teams contributors, which we have seen throughout OTAs, minicamp, and all that. And then elevate him from the practice squad to start the season. I think that might be a wise way to go.
Yeah, I think they did that with Alex Arma a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And I want to say they did that with Prentice last year. And stuff.
So
I just think from a nobody's going to be chomping at the bit to grab a fullback, right? I mean, in no disrespect to the position or anything, but I think the Saints have a clear vision. But I would say this about, because we got asked the question about the Prentice Horvath battle, if you will, which is still a battle. I think Horvath has got the athleticism. Special teams is what's going to make the difference there, right? And I think Horvath, his upside is maybe a little bit more than Prentice, but man, Prentice, don't sleep on him. I mean, the guy can block, he can do a lot of things for you. I mean, I know people probably think about last year and stuff, but I think he made up for some of that stuff as well. But man, it'll be one of those subtle things that we look at, and it's not going to turn a lot of heads. My other question is, we've also talked about, I mean, obviously the running backs that are left out of the equation, that's Jordan Mims, who we think has been pretty impressive, Jacob Kubota, and James Robinson. And so the thing is, I think Mims could be a practice squad guy easily, but if they were to shape it up, if they shake it up a little bit, I could see an argument saying Mims could be that fourth running back there early on, if he can prove himself in the preseason. I think training camp's going to be huge for him. I know he's learned this offense. He's not stopping to learn this offense, so he's doing everything he can to try to be in a spot where he can make this team. And so I think that's somebody to keep an eye on if I'm watching out for potential guys that could make something of themselves, for sure.
Absolutely. Talking to him not too long ago was really fun because I was asking him kind of like, how are you feeling about the new offense and all these things in terms of what was different from last year, since he was one of those guys that kind of bridged the gap. And one of the things that he talked about was that he particularly was alluding to the passing game that he absolutely loves, because basically the way that he said it was, there's a lot of times in the NFL you're asked to run a route, but you're not actually a part of the progression. In this offense, no matter what, you're a part of the plan some way, somewhere, and everything. And he was like, it feels good to be utilized like that. And so just like hearing him discuss it from that angle was really, really interesting. And I think one of those things that goes to show you, like, you've got to love what you're doing. And clearly he's enjoying what's happening right now in New Orleans.
For sure. Absolutely. Now moving to wide receiver, which obviously is another fun one. So 6 guys that you picked. You got Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, A.T. Perry. No surprises there, right? You put Bub Means on there, which I think it's kind of like the Rattler if you waive him. And I think Bub Means has a lot of capabilities. We just haven't seen it yet. And then that's not really that surprising to me. Went with a veteran, Cedric Wilson Jr. and Equanimous St. Brown. Talk a little bit about your decisions there, because 6 receivers, I think that's probably a smart choice. But we're leaving off like Stanley Morgan Jr., Jermaine Jackson, Mason Tipton, and some of that stuff. And obviously they waived Kyle Sheets, but talk about your thought process there.
Yeah. Stanley Morgan Jr. was easy to leave off right now because we simply haven't seen him. Right. So he has a real opportunity during training camp because of his special teams acumen and all that. So we'll see where that goes. And special teams is a lot of the reasons why I also kept Well, there's actually two things that I kept Equanimeous St. Brown on for. There is a special teams part. We've watched him line up as an additional protector on the new kickoff. Typically, it's two running backs or two wide receivers that are involved in that grouping, along with like a big body defensive end that's like the last sort of line of protection and all that. So I think that's one piece of it. The other thing that's a piece of it for me too is this Clint Kubiak wide zone offense is going to want to extend the offensive line laterally as much as possible. EQ is a really, really good blocker, really stout, really solid blocker, big body too. So you could just kind of impose over like smaller slot corners and things like that. So you put him in the inside and all of a sudden your offensive line gets about 4 or 5 yards wider out laterally. And I think that really helps. So guys like him and Cedric Wilson help big time when it comes to that. I also think that we heard Dennis Allen say 2 off seasons ago now that, or I guess an off season ago now, that losing Michael Thomas, one of the biggest things that they lost were contested catches. And he's made some of the better contested catches in camp so far. And so that's another one of those sort of, it doesn't mean he's going to get 80 targets in a season, but man, if he's able to make good on 20, if he's able to make good on 15, operating as the 5th or 6th wide receiver there and pulls in a touchdown or 2, then that's that value of getting that contested catch red zone guy that might be able to help you out a little Jimmy Grahamish, if you will, in terms of that way. So that's one of the reasons why I kept him on there. Bub means I kept on because of special teams, and then the other 4 just feel pretty obvious to me.
Yeah, obviously, for those who don't know, Cedric Wilson has been operating the slot. So he's their slot guy. He's been running the first team. I expect that to continue, right? But he's been doing a good job of it, too. And so I think it gives him a little bit of a different element. And, of course, there's still, players that could still join. It's funny because this Justin Simmons stuff, not to jump around, but that's been getting hot. Like, I mean, we've been talking about that since January. I mean, this is not really new information, but people are treating it like that. But, I think Wilson makes sense to me. And St. Brown, I mean, of course, they're going to have to learn more in the special teams. And Darren Rizzi said as much that, these guys are going to have to, you're going to have different looks at the return team. You're going to have different looks on the cover team. And so St. Brown and Cedric Wilson, I mean, they've been doing stuff like that. And so as Bub Means as a gunner. And so, I mean, look, I think the best is yet to come for, Bub Means. I think he's going to get a lot of good looks in there. But, I think when you look at the undrafted guys like Mason Tipton, he's got some good bursts. Jermaine Jackson's a heck of a returner. I don't know if they can do enough to unseat some of those guys yet. But I'm with you on those 6 that those are your guys. And so I think, if you don't keep a Jermaine Jackson, you've got Taysom Hill and Rashid Shaheed. That's the trade-off, right? Mason Tipton, you've got A.T. Perry, you've got Chris Olave, you got Rashid Shaheed is somewhat Mason Tipton already, right? In my, I mean, just vague, I'm not.
I see what you're saying, but in terms of being like a third level threat kind of guy, like you've got those guys. I think Tipton and Jermaine Jackson also really good practice squad options as well, especially knowing that you might need a returner at any moment or something like that. Like that's a really good spot for those guys. And both of them have been involved in the return game throughout OTAs and minicamp as well.
For sure. And so again, I think if you go through this, there's really not too much that you would probably disagree with. Maybe look at it and stuff. And so I definitely tracked with you on this one. Your next one you had listed as offensive weapon, Taysom Hill, and we'll just group him in with the tight ends. And you put Juwan Johnson, Foster Moreau, and Dallin Holker. They did pick up Jesper Horsted, a tight end that used to be with the Raiders. It's funny because when I was looking at the tight end group, that was one of the ones I was gonna write about and put on there, but I'm like, nobody's gonna know this guy or anything like that. But he was somebody that has familiarity there. But I don't see there's a situation Dallin Holker doesn't make this roster right now. I think Taysom Hill's versatility, I mean, again, put him in his offensive weapon, football player. I mean, he plays personal punt protector. He can return. He can cover punts. He can cover kicks. I mean, and he could throw the ball. He can run the ball. You've seen him at tailback. I mean, the dude and it drives everybody crazy. But, what are we missing on the tight end? Because I guess the only other problem could be is if Juwan Johnson's injury lingers and then suddenly you're saying, ooh, maybe I have to look at a Jimmy Graham. And again, we talked about this on a previous last episode that we had. And again, we can bring some of that stuff back up. But, I think a lot of that depends on where Juwan's at.
Completely agreed. Yeah, if Juwan's not available to start the season, which right now is the expectation. So when we're
Correct.
looking at
Right.
like, okay, what's the state of the Saints right now? That would be, that would be included. But if he's not available, then yeah, I think you take a look at Jimmy Graham. There's also Michael Jacobson. There's also Jesper Horsted. Tommy Hudson, we haven't gotten to see much of, so I can't really loop him into the conversation. But look, I mean, what you're looking for if Juwan Johnson isn't ready to go is not a 70% of the snaps tight end. You're going to get all of that with Foster Morrow and Taysom Hill, and then a little bit of Dallin Holker. What you're going to be looking for is not for somebody to come in and slot in place of Juwan Johnson. Juwan Johnson goes out, the other guys move up, and then somebody has got to slot in at the bottom for the number. And so that's where I think maybe a guy like Michael Jacobson makes sense. 6'6", 6'7". I mean, just a guy to put out there and say, hey, go and make some tough catches in the red zone. Like that's what you did with Jimmy Graham last year. So you can either say, okay, I want this year's version of Jimmy Graham to see if they could do that, or I want to see if Michael Jacobson can do that. And, maybe you roll with that for a game, see how it goes, and then maybe have to make a decision from there, whatever it might be. Obviously, the preference for a lot of people would be just go get Jimmy Graham. But I think ultimately what Juwan Johnson not being available at the beginning of the season would mean, if that were the case, is just more Foster Morrow, more Taysom Hill, more Dallin Holker than it means more new tight end in the conversation.
Yeah, and when we didn't see Juwan Johnson, I mean, we saw Foster Moreau get a lot of targets. I mean, like 7 in one day, in one practice. And so, again, I think this is going to be an uptick for Moreau in his development and his stats and stuff. But, you mentioned Jacobson, again, him and Tommy Hudson, those were practice squad guys last year that, just kind of hung around a good bit. And so, I don't think there's anything. I think Holker is going to be somebody that is, if he can really show us a little bit more at training camp, then we'll be like, man, this guy is going to be something pretty good in this offense. And then that still may only mean that he makes a couple of catches or a couple of targets a game. And I think that's everybody's got to remember is, just because you make the final roster, just because you're on here doesn't necessarily mean you're guaranteed playing time and stuff. Like, look what happened to some of the guys like Jimmy Graham, a familiar inactive. Now, some of that was because they didn't know how to use him, right? Or weren't really learning how to use them. Yeah. We got to do a better job. But, some of that stuff was a little bit puzzling. You always have an extra offensive lineman that usually sits and stuff. So I think more information is obviously going to be needed, but training camp is an obviously opportunity, which is like less than 30 days now. And so it's coming up quick, Ross. Like, not to segue, man. I'm so excited. And so we've got some fun plans out there for training camp, maybe doing a live show. We've got some things that we're going to be working on in the lab, if you will, but it'll be fun. It'll be real fun. Now let's go to the O-line. And so no big surprises, right? You got the starting 5. You're putting Taliese Fuanga at left tackle, Nick Saldivari at left guard, Eric McCoy at the center, Cesar Ruiz at right guard, and then Trevor Penning at right tackle. Now you got 3 extras. Landon Young, totally agree, because he's versatile as everything. Oli Udo, who we've really not seen a lot of, and Shane Lemieux. Obviously, no Josiah Aziram. And then obviously Lucas Patrick would be another one. And then, last year I'm thinking about Mark Evans. We haven't seen a lot from him as well. Guys like Kyle Hergel, not on there. I mean, these are some of the guys that probably are practice squad priorities, but talk about the offensive line. What do you like about that? And maybe why not 9? Because I think 9 is probably the typical number to keep.
Yeah, I think I went with 8 because of the versatility, but this would be a spot to where if you didn't keep the fullback, then you keep a Lucas Patrick in addition, and then you have even more versatility. I kind of cheated a little bit by throwing Oli Udo on here. That was one of the ones where it's like, okay, I probably shouldn't have put him on there because we haven't really seen him yet. But I just think having another one of those tackle guard versatile guys, I look at Landon Young as tackle versatile in terms of side, although he has been asked to take some reps on the interior. It hasn't been his strongest doing that. So I have him as a guy that can, play tackle on either side. I look at Oli Udo as a tackle guard versatile guy. And then I looked at Shane Lemieux as a guard center versatile guy. The reason why I didn't put Lucas Patrick on here is because he got into a fight with Trajan Jeffcoat, and now I don't know what's going on with him anymore. So, I don't know if how much the Saints are going to react to that, all those other things. So I'm waiting to see how that whole thing, kind of like pans out. I think if something drastic were going to happen, it probably would have happened already, but I didn't want to over project anything there. So that's why I ended up making the swap out there. Evans, we haven't gotten to see much of yet. Hergel's somebody that we have seen, but his limitation of being a guard, I think, is one of the things that maybe makes him more practice squad for me than active roster for me at this moment. And then Josiah Ziram, I think, is a later in 2024 guy or a 2025 guy. I mean, this is a dude that's only been playing offensive line for like 2 seasons of his life and everything. And so I don't think you draft him in the 7th round thinking, yeah, he's going to be out there. He's going to be, he's going to be on the active roster. Blah, blah. I think he's the guy that you draft and say, okay, development now doesn't mean active roster anymore. Development can happen from the practice squad. And we've seen that with a couple of different guys now. And so that's kind of where I put him at the moment. It's not because he's disappointed. It's not because he's underperformed or anything like that. I just think that the plan with him is development. So I look at him as a redshirt guy.
And everybody's got to remember here that you don't get anything really off of offensive linemen and defensive linemen until you get into training camp. And it's one of the things I had a conversation with John Vinton, the offensive line coach. And he's like, right now, it's just being in the proper position. It's all about, knowing everything or learning everything now. So you know what to do when training camp comes on. And, everybody knows when the pads come on, that's the big deal. Right. And so I think we'll see a lot more from these guys, and then preseason will be big too. And so I think there's some fluidity there, but I think Udo, I mean, you look at him, he was a staple in Kubiak's Minnesota offense. And
exactly.
I think Lucas Patrick, obviously Chicago, the Chinoco ties, all that other stuff. There's other ones there that could make the argument, but I don't think there's anything crazy off there at the rails. And Landon Young can play guard. He can play left tackle. He can play right tackle. He can do a lot of things. And versatility is the name of the game. And the more versatile you are, the more valuable you are as a roster asset. I mean, it's just simplistic. All right. So you got 25 offensive players, which means you're going to have 25 defensive players and the 3 specialists. And I can't wait.
Which is how the Saints roster has been breaking out for like a little while now. It's actually kind of weird.
Yeah, right.
I'm used to one side being heavier than the other, but they've been 25-25 for a little while now. And so I was like, okay, I guess I'll keep that going. Boring. Right. I'll do it.
Let's keep the trend. Yeah, for sure. So let's look at the edge group. And so no surprises again, Cam Jordan, Carl Granderson, Chase Young, Peyton Turner, and Isaiah Foskey. And so everybody's got to remember Tano tore his Achilles in the offseason, and he's not going to be ready at the start of the season. He might not be until look for him after mid-season, right? Maybe even late seasons, because those Achilles injuries are interesting, right? And again, I don't know if you're going to get enough from some of the guys like a Trajan Jeff Coat, or everybody knows about what Nico Lalos was last year, preseason darling, right, if you will. And so I don't know if there's anybody right now in that edge group that we can say that would go up against a Foskey or Turner, and the hope is that both of them are what the Saints need, right?
Yep. And they're the prototype through and through. I think that counts for something as well. Nico Lalos is also, by the way, another one of those guys that everybody said, don't let him go to waivers because somebody's going to pick him up, and then nobody picked him up.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, this one felt obvious for me. Like, no big surprises. This one was pretty simple.
Yeah, no, and I don't think there's anything else. I think what we've talked about is what the plan is. And we've talked about Peyton Turner in the sub rush. We've talked about, the vision for Chase Young and how he's doing, and Cam, what his workload is going to look like. And I think we expect Carl Granderson. I think that he could be a double-digit sack person when it's all said and done. If they can shore up a few things on the defensive line, I think he could get to double-digit sacks this year. And Saints need it, right? I mean, they just do. And so they got to finish the plays. We've talked about that plenty, but I just don't know that there's anything off in some of the guys that they had signed, like the undrafted guys. We mentioned Jeff Coat, but they already waived Nathan Latu. I don't think we were really surprised by that. He was hurt again, and he just wasn't able to do much of anything. And so, no big surprises, and that's pretty straightforward for this team, right?
On the Carl Granderson double-digit sack season thing, I'm curious how much offensive lines having to account for Chase Young makes Carl Granderson an even bigger threat, and then vice versa. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm really excited to see all 3 of those guys, the 2 of them and Cam Jordan, out on the field at the same time.
I know you're talking about getting your 4 best rushers on the field. And so, I mean, if you could Turner inside possibly is something. I mean, I wonder what they're going to do with the Zach Bond type thing, right? Like who's going to be that guy that potentially can do that? Is that a Willie Gay Jr.? Is somebody else maybe potentially? But it's fascinating. I think when you look at that, that's the nerd in us that, man, we really get excited about stuff like that. But the average person's not thinking about that, right? They just see, here's the guys who should get after the quarterback and are paid to get after the quarterback, which fair. But, now defensive tackle, moving on, for no surprises. We got Colin Saunders, Nathan Shepard, Brian Brzee, which I think he's going to take a major leap this year. And then Christian Boyd. Man, I don't know how much clearer that can be. You know, I think when you look at the interior defensive line, obviously, I think Christian Boyd, we've talked about how there's a lot of semblances of Malcolm Roach, but maybe a little bit more upside, if you will. Especially his ability to get after the quarterback and just how much he's flashed as well. But man, you know, that leaves guys like Jack Heflin. It leaves guys like Kyler Ball, which again, Ball is one of my guys I keep an eye on as you go into training camp. But you know, I don't think, and obviously the other one that they had, Kendall Vickers, the veteran guy that could be obviously somebody that could go back to the practice squad, but he's seen a lot of time with the first team. You know, defensive interior, pretty straightforward, or are we overlooking something?
We could be overlooking something, but I don't think so. I think a good portion of the reason why Kendall Vickers has been in those first team snaps is because for the majority of camp, Brian Brzee hasn't been heavily participating, and Nathan Shepard has been, you know, he had his family thing, if I recall correctly. It was like a personal thing that he was away from. Maybe not a family thing, but it's like a personal thing that he was away from for. And so, so it wasn't until, you know, those guys were back that we started seeing them get back into the fold and stuff like that. So I think that's what that had more to do with. But Kendall Vickers, I mean, great veteran practice squad option for you. If he, I don't know if he's got the accrued seasons actually to hit as a veteran practice squad guy, but a great practice squad option for you nonetheless. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this 4 is the 4, as long as everybody stays healthy through training camp.
Yeah, and I think 4 is. You look at the track history, they keep 4.
Yeah, it's typically
4 is it, and you'll have somebody on the practice squad, maybe 2 of them on the practice squad because it's 16, right? And so that just makes a lot of sense to me. I don't think there's any big surprises on defensive interior. Nothing that could really shake up. Again, we hope nobody gets, but injuries happen, and so if something happens, God forbid, then it could shake things up. But no big surprises. Now, linebackers. This one's a fun one. Obviously, there's no big difference between the top 3: Demario Davis, Pete Werner, Willie Gay Jr. Then where you go is Khaleke Hudson, which I would agree there, and DeMarco Jackson, completely agree. And you got Jalen Ford on there, which we haven't seen a ton from him, but obviously that leaves off guys like Anthony Orje, and then it obviously leaves off one of my guys, Isaiah Stallbird. Nephi Sewell's not on there, but he's also hasn't been there because of the ACL injury. Very interesting, I'd say, is that if they keep 6, but you know, I like it. I'm just, what are you thinking on Jalen Ford? Because I know you've talked to him. I've talked to him a little bit. He obviously was injured early on with the sports hernia, what he had surgery on, and now he's back in action, but should be a full go for training camp.
Yeah, and I think just seeing him get back into action during minicamp and then like immediately leap into early snaps was kind of surprising for me. They just kind of they kind of just like fed him to the wolves immediately there, and I thought that was great. I thought that showed a lot of trust into what he would, you know, kind of be able to bring and what it is that they're expecting of him and all those other things. I think too, just like the IQ, the instincts, that those are all things that the Saints value so much at that position, the ability to communicate, they value it so much at the position. And then, you know, but at the same time, I could see a guy like Monty Rice holding that spot. If they keep 6, they might not, they might keep 5. And that could be another way that they go and everything. So I kind of threw him in there because I also think he's a drafted asset. And the Saints track record as of late is that drafted players make the roster. I couldn't make that leap with Josiah Zerum as a guy that's only played the position for 2 years. I could easily make that leap for a guy like Jalen Ford, who has played that position for a while. And even, you know, I think he was one of those guys that had like extra eligibility, played through that as well, utilized it. And so it just made sense that he would be a guy that could make it there based on what the Saints have done in the past.
Yeah. And we've also mentioned the fact that, you know, this is a guy that, I mean, I know Demario wants to play until ever, right? But he has a potential set that he could, you know, skill set that could make him a really solid Mike linebacker. a really solid guy down the line. And so, again, he's one that I just fascinated to see more of in training camp. But, you know, guys like DeMarco Jackson, don't sleep on him because he's extremely valuable to the special teams unit and he can play a good bit. And then Khaleke Hudson, super special teams guys. Like, I think when you look at some of these guys the Saints have signed, not just free agents, but the guys that they brought in or re-signed too, there is a lot of a special teams background and mold for a lot of these guys. And so I think it's telling in some aspects, but you know, Khaleke Hudson played a lot of football down the stretch for Washington. And like I said, they found out about him too late. Right. And so he was making plays, but you know, Saints obviously swiped him up and got him for sure. And so,
and I look at each of those guys. It is. I look at each of those guys too as an immediate backup to somebody that's starting. I look at DeMarco as a good Sam backup, strong side run defender type. I look at Khaleke as a Will weak side coverage guy, and then I look at Jalen as a Mike middle of the field communicator guy. So each one of those guys has a specific role to back up, learn, focus on all those other things. It's another reason why I went with 6.
For sure. Again, you're not going to get any disagreements here for me. I think that's the thing is I think we think so alike in some of this. It's like, I mean, maybe it drives people crazy, but I think that's just the point is that we see the same things from the team and kind of predict the same things. And I'm not saying that they're telling or it's like, you know, so revealing, but I think when we look at the minds, talk to coaches, know what this team does and covering for so many years, kind of makes sense, right? You know, there's always those surprises, but I don't see too many this year so far because we got a whole 21-day stretch of training camp, 3 preseason games coming. So that'll be, you know, a chance for some of these guys to distance themselves. But, and now moving to the secondary, we're going to start with corner group. You pick 5. You got Marshawn Lattimore, Paul Adebo, Alontae Taylor, Kool-Aid McKinstry, and then Shamar Jean-Charles. I don't disagree with that one. You know, because I think he has a chance to be new Ike Yadam. That's really where I think about him. And so again, he's a guy that joined the team kind of late and stuff. And he's just, I don't mean it in a disrespectful way, but nobody knows who he is. Right. You know what I'm saying? But he's a guy that we've seen put in some work, be a solid staple as a secondary backup corner, right? And is getting all the work in special teams. So maybe talk about the corner group. Obviously, we know McKinstry's going to be in. That's unless something happens with his foot. Hopefully not. But Jean Charles, he's going to be a role player potentially.
Yeah, and he was a big part last year of how the Saints maintained their punt coverage ability while JT Gray was dealing with his injury and was out for a little while. So the Saints trust him. They know what he can do as a special teamer, just like Isaac Yadam. Now, Isaac Yadam then turned into really, really solid depth at the position, but I don't think you have to look at Jean Charles to be that guy when you've got Kool-Aid McKinstry. Like you're 4 deep in terms of starter caliber players when it comes to corner. And then so the other guy is the special teamer. So that's kind of the way that I look at it there. But look, we've also watched him take snaps in the slot and out wide. So I do think there's something to that versatility as a, you know, fallback option, reserve option on defense that could, you know, also keep him around.
Yeah. And again, I think we're going to get more. And that's the thing is you got to remember the caveat. When training camp goes along, there's so much information, what they do in the preseason game. And some people can practice like garbage and show out in the preseason, but then vice versa. They can be really good in the preseason in practice, and in the preseason game, you're like, where'd this guy go? You know what I mean? And so I think when you look at the tape evaluation process, because they record every practice. I mean, they can go back and literally watch the film on everything. And so, yeah, you had something.
Which of those would you prefer? Like trying to look at that, like as a coach or something like that. Which would you prefer? Would you prefer the guy that practices well but struggles in the preseason, or performs in the preseason well but struggles in practice? Because mine is so easy. Like I don't even have to like question it.
I'd want to know what the struggles are in practice, because in practice, a lot of the stuff is somewhat like everybody knows what's going to happen most of the times in practice and stuff. In preseason, it's live bullets, right? I mean, how you do in those situations, I think measure a lot more, but you got to be able to pick up the fundamentals in practice and such. And so I think sometimes, like, you know, one-on-ones, they cater more to the offense. So we make a big deal about it because, oh my gosh, look at Chris Olave burn toast on Marshawn Lattimore. But that's a drill that caters to the offense. And so I think the preseason, a lot of times, not every time, but I think I tend to lean more to the preseason being more of a telltale for me. I think practice is good and you want to show it in practice, but preseason is where you kind of want to see it, but it's not always. Like, I guess there's a balance to be had in some aspects. I know it's kind of like taking the fence approach, but again, Jack Heflin, Nico Lalos, Emmanuel Butler, the guys we mentioned earlier, they had good preseasons, but they're also buried on the depth chart. So it's like, you can't ask some of those guys to really make the final roster based off of what they do in a couple preseason games if they're not catching on practice too.
Yeah. For me, it's the guy that excels in practice. If you, because we're not talking about starters here, right? Because this isn't a conversation that you're going to have about Chris Olave. This isn't a conversation you're going to have about your starting quarterback. This isn't a conversation that you're having about your starting anything. This is depth. And so for me, I'll campaign for the guy that stood out in practice if he struggled in the preseason, because for me, if you practice well, you'll get there and everything. And all that I'm learning is that you haven't gotten the short memory yet, basically. And so if you can get the short memory, focus on your fundamentals, focus on your technique, and win with your technique. And maybe this varies by position too, which could be really interesting. We don't have to go into all that right now, but maybe you like one over the other in terms of position. I could certainly see myself leaning one way or another depending on position. But particularly for me in the secondary, I'll take the guy that practices well, has the technique, has the fundamentals down, all that kind of stuff, but hasn't yet learned the short-term memory of playing in the NFL or playing at this highest level yet. And I would continue to roll the dice on that guy as a developmental piece, or, practice squad, or, reserve guy or whatever. I go the other way. Give me the guy that practices really well.
Sure. And I think, when I look at some of that too, I see your point for sure. And and a lot of time points I do agree with, but like for a guy like Trevor Penning, you have to do both. Like you got to be able to practice well, and you have to show up in the preseason. Like if you're struggling 100%. In practice and you're struggling in the preseason, then that's your precursor that this is not going to be good. Like you either get it or you don't. Right. And so I think for some of the other guys, yes, like in the bottom part of the roster, you've got to learn to practice. You got to learn those reps. And then if you don't do it in the preseason, I don't think that's a big a deal. But if you're expected to be a contributor and produce, then you better show it in practice, and you better show it on preseason. And if it's not
you can't
totally
struggle.
there, you can get coached. Right.
Yeah. You can struggle a couple snaps, but you better not be struggling.
If you're then of course you don't always eat the cheese too. You know what I mean? Right. So it's just always just, and it gives somebody, because you got to remember too, in the preseason, you're also auditioning for 31 other teams, because there's a lot of roster cuts. You got to go from 90 to 53, and they don't have that middle cut down anymore. And so you're putting your skills out on display for a lot more people. And so you're not going to always see that stuff in practice, but if they see it in the game, then, they might bite on you for sure. And, it's obviously another thing to remember. All right. Moving to the last line of defense, the safety group. Tyrann Mathieu, Jonathan Abram, Jordan Howden, Will Harris, JT Gray, and Justin Simmons. No, I'm just kidding. We didn't put him but JT Gray, I don't disagree with any of that. Gray, he's been a little bit interesting because he was hurt a little bit last year, missed a little bit of time. This camp so far, I don't know if it's something he's been lingering, battling and stuff, but I still think Gray's one of the premier special teams players in this league, and obviously can play the safety position if he needed to. We've talked about Jordan Howden in his leap, Jonathan Abrams in for a big deal and an elite. Will Harris has got some versatility to him, and obviously he's a big special teams guy too. And so again, you left off Ugo Amadi, that's somebody and I think Ugo is an interchangeable piece, right? You could say, let me not take the fullback and I want to keep Ugo Amadi, right? Or you could put him on a practice squad. Like that's an easy, legitimate, that's the fluidity of it. But, talk about the defensive back group, because you're leaving off guys like Miller Bradford, Rico Payton, who we've seen a good bit of, and some of the other guys that we've just started to see a little bit in OTAs that can make something of themselves.
Yeah, I look at Miller Bradford as like a premier practice squad guy. You know what I mean? It's that safety room has so many players. There's just so many players. And so after a moment, you just kind of go, okay, well, the Saints, their track record is experience over excitement and everything. And so Miller Bradford has been really exciting, coming up with 3-4 interceptions over the course of OTAs, minicamp, mandatory minicamp, all that. But JT Gray, Will Harris, we're talking about, Tyrann Mathieu, Jonathan Abram, we're talking about experience. Jordan Howard, we're talking about a guy that's on the team for a second year. They're gonna invest in that over the flashy splash moments and stuff. Right. And so I think Miller Bradford makes a fantastic practice squad option. And so by the looks of this, I have one undrafted free agent making the roster this year, which has been more and more the case for New Orleans as of late. But the practice squad is a different story. And so I made the decision to keep JT Gray, but I truly believe JT Gray has to earn his spot this year. Because of the injuries, all that other stuff. He's phenomenal. He's fantastic. He's a great dude, all that. But everybody's going to give a little bit of side eye about the injury history that's building up now and stuff like that. And so that stinks, but it means he's going to have to earn his spot. And so that's where a guy like Ugo Amadi can make things really challenging. That's where a guy like Shamar Jean Charles can make things really challenging as well. I kept guys off that weren't incumbent. I chose Will Harris because of the versatility. It just fits what it is that Dennis Allen loves over on that side. We've also seen him earlier in rotations and things like that as well. But look, I wouldn't mind if, you just have to keep 5 linebackers, then you keep an extra one of these guys, because like a guy like Ugo can play down as a dime linebacker if he needed to. Same thing for Will Harris, same thing for Jonathan Abram. And so you can handle those types of situations there. And so I think you're right. Like there's a lot of interchangeability, not just amongst the safeties themselves, but you could leave Jean Charles off, have Ugo in, and then Ugo is your backup slot corner, while Alante is your starting slot corner and backup outside corner, and Kool-Aid your backup slot and outside corner. Like you're covered and everything. So there's a lot of different ways that this could go. But I just kind of leaned in on what we've seen in terms of rotations and stuff like that. The other thing that I'll say in Ugo's defense too is he's done a little bit of that punt protector responsibility. He's been all over kickoff coverage, been all over special teams and things like that. So I think he deserves a better shakeout than maybe what I gave him. But I was just trying to make, you got to figure out how to make the numbers work here. And that was a situation where the numbers just didn't work.
Yeah. And again, these are like veterans. When you look at the final roster, some people are going to get left off, but I don't say a handshake deal, but it's like, hey, we're going to cut you, but we plan on bringing you right back because we got to work out some logistics. I mean, that happens all the time. All the time. Another guy I want to see more of too. I forgot about to mention Lawrence Johnson, the SEMO guy, that I think he's somebody that could also, and I think for Bradford, like you mentioned earlier, he's a guy that is making splash plays, but we've talked about him. Marcus Robertson's the best teacher for him. Is that him coming in college is just the level and consistency, right? And a guy like Marcus Robertson, if he can take to the coaching, which I know he's head deep in that playbook right now. And so I think that it's something that he can learn and grow and adapt and everything. And so again, you may not see it immediately, but it is one of those that we like to think. I think you mentioned it early, but one undrafted free agent, like we're probably past the days. I mean, this has been past several years where you just don't have as many undrafted rookies that make the roster anymore, right? You don't have the Peyton days where you had like 5 or 6 maybe that make out and just beat out the veterans or show better stuff. I mean, it's just not as common. And I don't think the Saints is the only team that does that, but I think when you look at experience versus not experience, that Saints need people that they can trust, and especially with this offense that's complex, this defense that's so somewhat complex as well, that you want guys out there that know what they're doing. And that's not a shot at the younger guys, but they just got to be patient and learn and develop. That's all.
Yep. Completely agree.
All right. So wrapping it up, we got special teams. Now no surprises on this one, but obviously sticking with the incumbents. And of course we can't forget Zach Wood, long snapper, right? He's obviously got a roster spot on there. The one and only who has the lowest Madden rating like year after year. It's the funniest thing in the world. But you stuck with Blake Grupe and stuck with Lou Hedley, which I don't think is crazy, but talk about your thought process, because I can give you my take as well.
Yeah, it's pretty quick. I mean, look, Charlie Smith, who's in competing as a kicker, he's exciting, he's new, but the lack of consistency that we saw so far doesn't lend to him so far challenging or pushing Blake Grupe. So we need to see more of that during training camp first. And you're not going to make a decision on your kicker in OTAs and minicamp. You're going to make that decision seeing it in training camp and in the preseason and all that. So it would be disingenuous of me to right now put Charlie Smith ahead of Blake Grupe. Similarly, when it comes to Lou Hedley and Matthew Hayball, same thing. There's been some consistency stuff with Hayball. There's been more consistency and more variety shown as well with Lou Hedley. I think him adding the more traditional NFL punt style to his rugby punt style goes a long way.
Yeah.
Makes him a bit more impactful all over the field, which I think is big. And we have just listened now to coach after Mickey, after whoever, just defend the living daylights out of what Lou Hedley did for them last year. They love what they did for him last year. He's set to do more, as in additional different things for them this year. It's hard to argue that he won't be the guy or isn't the guy as of right now. Let me say it that way.
Yeah, and I know people don't really think about it, but the field goal operation too, like we saw with the difference between Grupe kicking with Matt Hayball versus Lou Hedley, and of course that's stuff that can get addressed and fixed, and that's not a big deal, but some of that does matter. Now here's the thing I would say about Charlie Smith too, is he's an international pathway player, so he's a roster exemption to begin with, right? And so there is no pressure to say we need to put him on a roster, and he's obviously competing and doing these things, but he's got a roster exemption for the Saints, and so they don't have to do anything with Charlie Smith, but he can learn, and obviously he has a heck of a leg. I mean, he was after practice hitting from like 68, and he can hit from 70 if he wanted to. It's just the accuracy. I mean, and of course, if he's covering a kick, I feel better about him trying to tackle somebody than Blake Grupe, but
sure,
but Hedley, again, we've talked about the logic behind it. I get it. It's not sexy. It's not attractive, but if you punt at 60 and you have a 10 on a return versus you punt at 50 with no return, you're netting the same result, right? Still 50-yard return, 50-yard punt. I mean, so again, that's the logic the Saints are thinking with. Not necessarily what I say is agreeable or anything, because obviously a punt, you could go further, all these other things, but Hedley, I think is shown a little bit more versatility, like you said. And so I again, tie goes to runner, just like last year. I think the incumbents that it felt like a safe bet to keep Will Lutz and Blake Gillikin, and the Saints like, no, fam, we're gonna do this differently. Which Rizzy said, it was neck and neck, because Grupe was doing extremely well in training camp, and then Gillikin was inconsistent, but Hedley was, they had the vision there, right? And so, so that is your way too early, right after minicamp, 53-man roster projection for the New Orleans Saints, which probably is going to be pretty close to accurate once we get into training camp, once we get to the final roster. I'm not saying that we know anything, but I think we have a good idea of what that's going to be like. And so, again, we mentioned at the top of the show, you're looking at probably 10 roster spots that probably have some jostling to it, right? Maybe up to 15, but, we're going to get a better gauge on some of these guys, and it's going to be an exciting time, man. You're going to get out here on vacation. You're going to Europe, dude.
Yeah, dude. I can't wait.
You got to be stoked, right?
I can't wait.
And what's that flight going to be like?
Not too bad. I think it's like I got to connect in New York, and it's like a 7-hour flight and everything like that. So it's not terrible. That's nothing. I'd do that. I could do that sitting down in an airplane. I think that like the thing that I've been so excited to go back to different parts of Europe since we went to London for the game. And then I escaped to Paris for a little while and stuff like that. And so like, I'm so excited to be out there and just experience something new, a little bit more wilderness, doing a little bit of city, a little bit of in the woods. So it's going to be a lot of fun. It's gonna be great. Can't wait.
Dope, man. Yeah, I hope you have a blast, dude. And so
thanks, dude.
Nobody has earned a vacation more than Ross Jackson. He's locked on work and all that good stuff. I don't know, man.
You earned yours. That's for sure.
Yeah, I had a great time at the beach. We didn't have to run into any sharks. There were some double red flags, but obviously I changed a couple of shades darker, and I told my wife, I'm like, I came back looking like an extra toasty cheesy, man. That's kind of what happened. So, and then I know people that listen, but like, this is my tan line Like this
Ooh,
is,
boy.
and then the light doesn't even do it justice. But I mean, I've literally probably went 3-4 shades darker in the sun. So my kids too, but you know, it's fun. It was a great time, man.
It's all part of it, man.
Yeah, man. But well, Ross, we
awesome.
obviously wish you safe travels.
Thanks, man.
Safe. Stay safe.
Much appreciated.
Stuff. And man, we'll be back. If anything happens, you'll get me, I'm sure, for some stuff. But if not, we'll probably be back next week or two. We'll see what happens and how things shake out. But we're gonna let Ross enjoy things. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button to Second and Saints. Get all your information on the go with our podcast, Spotify, Apple, all that good stuff, and more things are going to come. But that's going to do it for this episode. If you got anything for us, you know where to find us on social. If not, check the links below. We got all the information that you need. Hit us up if you got suggestions or anything, comments, criticisms, concerns. We're there for you. And like I said, since we hit over 1,000 subscribers, thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Got a special raffle coming to courtesy of Foco for a special Saints themed apron set. So stay tuned for that. Appreciate you guys. On behalf of Ross Jackson, I'm John Hendricks signing out for another episode of Second Saints. Y'all be good people.